Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the hottest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, join me once again as we continue to go through our Basically series. For those of you who are new to this is the series I have put together that will allow you to make the best budget starter decks out there that will not require you to spend a single rare or mythic to build.
Say what?
That's right, so without further ado, we are going to continue through our 4-color decks with a deck today I am calling, basically, Phyrexia. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content. You can support me monthly for a small amount on Patreon, where I have all of my extended bonus footage posted. We also have a Redbubble spot where you can buy merch like stickers and shirts, or for free, all you can just do also is just join our growing community on Discord. Your support helps keep this channel going. All links are in the details below. Longtime viewers of the channel know how we do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we dive right in. So basically, Phyrexia deck, as I mentioned earlier, is a 4-color deck, meaning it's going to be white, blue, black, and green. You're looking at an average mana curve of about 2.2, and the deck is as simple as can be. We're rocking 40 creatures and only 20 lands. As the name suggests, basically Phyrexia is an all-creature build, as you just saw, that is just trying to put together a pile of them to generate a ton of value. We have some of our creatures that will be sacrificed for that value, some of them will be able to be recurred from the graveyard from our proliferate ability, and as we proliferate, we're going to try to throw out a couple of poison counters onto our opponent, so if we cannot beat them down with our creatures, we can just hopefully poison them out to close out the game very quickly. The deck has a little bit of everything, and you may be wondering right now, how is it possible to put together a 4-color creature deck on such a tight budget?
Good question!
Well, I'm glad you asked. Starting with the creatures in the 1-drop slot, we will have Crawling Chorus and we'll have Billowas Skull Dweller here. Crawling Chorus is going to be pretty much good for us in the early game to do some early damage, but of course we could sacrifice it later on for value because it will leave behind a Phyrexian Might. Billowas Skull Dweller also has the Toxic ability, but also has Death Touch, so it can kind of sometimes fight above its weight limit, but again, we just mostly want these here to get those early game poison counters on our opponent. As far as additional utility, in the 2-drop slot we'll have Benalich Sleeper here. While it doesn't have the ability of Toxic like our other creatures does, if we do manage to kick it, we can then sacrifice, say, like this Crawling Chorus as we just mentioned, to it to make sure that we can just get rid of something that our opponent has on the battlefield. If we need to, we also can then proliferate with Thrumming Bird here. As it deals combat damage to a player, we can then proliferate. Remember that again, with the proliferate ability, we can choose any number of permanents and or players and basically just give them an extra counter on top of that, allowing us to then just stack up more and more of those poison counters. Our additional support in the 2-drop slot will also have Armored Scrapgorger here. What's great about this card is, as it keeps tapping, you can then exile a card from any graveyard and then put an oil counter on it. Once it gets 3 oil counters, it now becomes a 3/3. So ideally, you can use this also as a mana dork, but also as graveyard hate. Our other card in the 2-drop slot will be Voidwing Hybrid here. One unique thing that's actually cool about this card is actually the fact that if we proliferate with, say, like Thrumming Bird here, we can keep bringing it back from the graveyard back to our hand. It also has Flying for evasion and also Toxic 1. However, we do need an additional way to kind of bring back and reuse some of our Phyrexian creatures. What I just forget to mention here is going to be also Phyrexian Missionary. I actually do want to talk about this card for just a brief moment. Phyrexian Missionary is a 2-mana 2/3 Phyrexian Human Cleric, and it has the kicker ability of 2 with also lifelink. If it does enter, and if it was quicked, return a target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this allows us to just keep redoing any one of our cards to just utilize them for extra value in our game plan. Going over into the 3-drop slot, we will have Phyrexian Censor here. This is also an incredibly powerful card with our whole Phyrexian game plan, so we'll talk about this also for just a brief moment. Phyrexian Censor is a 3-mana 3/3 Phyrexian wizard that simply says each player can't cast more than one non-Phyrexian spell each turn, and non-Phyrexian creatures enter tapped. That's an incredibly powerful card for us in the 3-drop slot. Once this goes down, it allows us to then just get much more aggressive with our game plan, and also slows down even control and combo decks from doing their thing. Our other card in the 3-drop slot will be Tainted Observer here. It also has the Toxic ability, and it also flies just like Voidwing Hybrid. However, whenever another creature we control enters, we can pay 2, and if we do, we can proliferate. So this also will trigger off Voidwing Hybrid to come back from the graveyard back to our hand, as well as also adding on more toxic counters as more creatures enter the battlefield. And then finally, in the 4-drop slot, we'll have 2 of each of these, which is Indoctrination Attendant here. It enters, it also has Toxic 1, however, when it enters, we can bounce back a permanent we control to our hand, and if we do, we can create a Phyrexian Might on top of that, so it helps us kind of build out our board just a little bit here, and it has a pretty good body as a 3/4. And then finally, our finisher for the whole deck that we'll also talk about here is going to be Necrogen Rot Priest. So, real briefly, Necrogen Rot Priest is a 4-mana, 1/5 Phyrexian zombie cleric. It has Toxic too, and whenever a creature we control with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, we get to put an additional poison counter on top of them. And it also has a secondary ability for 3 mana. Target creature we control with Toxic gains Death Touch until end of turn. Woo! What an incredible card that can do a lot in the 4-drop slot. So put this down, and we should be able to close out our opponent very quickly by stacking up a ton of poison counters, or at the very least we can add Death Touch to any one of our Toxic creatures to help again just push back against our opponent that may have a couple of big creatures we just don't want to deal with. As far as your land base is concerned, we are a budget deck, so we're going to work with what we got, even though it's going to be a little clunky for 4 colors. So hear me out for just a second here. Since we are an all creature deck, we can take advantage of Own Claim Territory and Secluded Courtyard. To make sure that we can fix all of our basic forests, swamps, islands, and plains, we'll have an entire set of Escape Tunnel here, allows us to then fetch out the basic that we need. Also, if we need to in the mid to late game, we can also sacrifice the Escape Tunnel to make target creature with a power 2 or less unblockable until end of turn. If you do like the deck and you do want to take it into best of 3, here's what you have for options, which may seem a little limiting, but we actually got a little creative with that sideboard. So for Artifact and Enchantment Hate, we will have Cankerbloom here, a Phyrexian fungus where you can pay 1 to sacrifice it to either destroy that artifact or enchantment, or you can also proliferate as you need to. If we just need to then provide a little bit of more life gain and drain, we'll have Elias Ilkor here, Sadistic Pilgrim, as our option here. Anytime a creature we control enters, we gain 1 life to stabilize, and anytime a creature we control dies, our opponent will lose 1 life. It also has Death Touch on it, so it's a great creature overall for our game plan. If we want to then pump up and do a little bit more aggro, we'll also utilize here Sculpted Perfection, an enchantment for 4 mana that gives all of our Phyrexians +1/+1, and also when it enters, we get to incubate 2, which gives us a nice little token if we need to then close out the game later on. For spot removal for the deck, we'll also utilize Annex Sentry here, a 3-mana 1/4 Phyrexian cleric with Toxic 1. As long as it enters, we can then exile an artifact or creature an opponent controls with a mana value of 3 or less, at least until the Sentry leaves the battlefield. And then finally, for a little anti-tempo play, we will also utilize Chrome Prowler here, an entire set of these. So Chrome Prowler is a 3-mana 3/2 with Flash. It's a Phyrexian cat, and when it does enter, we can tap down an opponent's creature that maybe we just don't want to have in our way to then hopefully just close out the game if we're getting a super aggro. Now, in terms of strategy for this deck, here's how I'm going to break it down for you. For the early part of the game, just basically play everything on curb. You ideally want to get out in the early turns your Toxic creatures. So in other words, Crawling Chorus, Billows Skulldweller should be in your opening hand. If you can get at least Tainted Observer or even a Voidwing Hybrid, that's great because then you'll have a flying evasive creature to keep putting more poison counters on our opponent. While we aren't technically all in on the poison mechanic, it is at least going to put pressure on your opponent to try to deal with those threats. So we will also have to kind of adjust accordingly. In other words, with our other flyer, Thrumming Bird, once we start getting proliferate triggers going off, your Voidwing Hybrid will be able to keep being brought back from the graveyard to our hand, which will most likely annoy your opponent quite a bit. Speaking of graveyard shenanigans, remember that Armor Scrap Gorger is, as I mentioned earlier, not only a mana dork, but also a solid graveyard piece. So time it right. Even if you don't need to utilize the Scrap Gorger's mana ability, sometimes just tapping it just to get rid of a specific card out of your opponent's graveyard can make the difference between shutting off their game plan and also just building up some counters so you can actually have another aggro threat on board with the Scrap Gorger. Save up your Phyrexian Missionaries and your Banalish Sleeper for when you do need to start sacrificing things for value and start bringing them back for, again, additional value on top of what you're sacrificing. Ideally, you should be sacrificing cards like Voidwing Hybrid after they've done their damage, or Crawling Chorus, so this way they can be brought back with Phyrexian Missionary. If you have to sacrifice your Banalish Sleeper, that's perfectly fine to do so. He's actually more of a sacrificial piece that's more essential to keeping alive your other cards that have Toxic to ensure you can get to your victory. And the one card that I'm definitely going to say is the linchpin to the whole deck is going to be Phyrexian Censor. This card is incredibly powerful for what it is, and once you have it down, a lot of opponents don't realize that they kind of shuts off a lot of their game plans. Control decks will have to deal with this unless they don't mind being stuck with only 1 spell a turn, and same thing with aggro decks. Most of them aren't going to run all Phyrexian creatures, so once they start coming into play tapped, you'll have no problem pushing through the remaining points of damage to get to your victory. The biggest advantage with the deck is how highly synergistic it is, so cards like Indoctrination Attendant or your Necrogen Rot Priest will be great ways to finish off your opponent, and don't be afraid to bounce back maybe a land or two just to replay them if you need to, just to trigger off the Attendant's ability. But this will lead us, of course, to the biggest weakness of the deck, and I'm pretty sure you can figure it out. Going all in on creatures means we are completely susceptible to Wraths and spot removal. Most decks like mono black midrange will most likely shut you down and will kind of make you feel a little sad. They probably won't pack in some actual wraths, but they'll have more than enough spot removal to take down everything. And if your opponent is throwing out you control, just be ready to anticipate those wraths. So you might have to slow down your game plan just a little bit, so that way you can just kind of force your opponent to waste a wrath before you can then rebuild your board state with your proliferate triggers or any of your other cards that could bring stuff back from the graveyard back to your hand. Yes, your mana base may look a little clunky, but I assure you, with a little bit of testing that I've done, it actually does work fairly well given the parameters and limitations that we put upon ourselves to make this as ultra budget as possible. Now, if you do like the deck and maybe you want to take it to the next level after what you saw today, as always, I will show you on screen right now a couple of quick little screen caps that I have of previous deck techs we have done throughout the course of this channel. If you haven't already noticed, several of those links have been scattered throughout this video, so be sure to click on one of those if you're interested in seeing what else this deck archetype can provide for you. And with that all out of the way, here are my final thoughts that I want to give on this deck. Overall, when it comes to creature-based strategies, Phyrexians are usually not my main go-to. However, what we saw today was a way to put together just enough of them in this format to actually kind of cobble together a surprisingly effective strategy, despite the fact that, as I mentioned many times earlier in this video, it looks rather clunky. However, with a little bit of patience and a little bit of strategy, you actually can pull off quite a few wins and throw off your opponent's game plan, because usually they will never see this strategy coming. So, to put it another way, if you're a fan of alternate win cons, if you're a fan of creature-based strategies, and if you're a fan of pulling off a ton of extra value for practically spending little to no investment of rares or mythics on your own, then I would definitely say, give this deck a try. And I assure you, when you manage to beat down your opponent with a bunch of cheap creatures to put a bunch of poison counters on them, you're going to have a lot of fun doing so, and you'll be very surprised at how it can pull it off on this budget, and you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone. And just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.